Olivia's heart jolted the moment she saw Nick enter the cafe. His gaze locked onto her as he made his way directly to her table. She had only just settled into her seat when she noticed him approaching. For nearly 4 years, Olivia and her husband, Brad, had lived next door to Nick and his wife, Louise. Despite the slight age gap, Nick and Louise being in their early 40s, while Olivia and Brad were in their mid-30s, the two couples had formed a close bond. They often spent time together, sometimes even traveling, with and without their children. "This is unexpected," Olivia remarked, curiosity lacing her voice as she cast a quick glance over his shoulder. "Shouldn't you be at work right now?" Nick offered a faint smile before settling into the chair across from her. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied casually. "Took the afternoon off to take care of something personal. Seems like you had the same idea." Olivia nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "Just needed a break after a hectic morning. I didn't expect to run into you here. I didn't think this was your kind of cafe." "It's not," Nick admitted, his eyes steady on her. "I saw you walk in and decided to join you." His directness made Olivia glance away, her fingers instinctively fidgeting with the rim of her cup. A sudden wave of unease settled over her. "What's going on?" she asked, concern etching her brow. "Is everything okay with Louise? She's not hurt, is she?" Nick's expression softened, and he offered a reassuring smile. "Louise is fine, but I appreciate your concern. You and Brad have always been dependable friends, which is part of why I needed to talk to you today." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Olivia's face. She hesitated before speaking. "What is this about?" Nick's demeanor shifted, his voice turning serious. His eyes held hers, unwavering. "Have you been involved with him?" A sharp heat rushed to Olivia's cheeks. Stunned, she stammered, What? I don't even know who you're talking about." Nick remained composed, his tone almost conversational. "The man you keep glancing at from across the room. You know exactly who I mean." Her pulse quickened as she struggled to make sense of his words. "No, I haven't," she blurted out, shaking her head. Her hands dropped to her lap, an unconscious defensive gesture that only seemed to amplify her discomfort. Nick studied her carefully before resting his hand lightly over hers. His voice softened. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "I need to explain what's really happening here, what you think is going on, and more importantly, what he believes is happening." Olivia hesitated, but eventually gave a small nod. Her mind raced, grasping for clarity. Nick leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a steady, measured tone. "He's charming, isn't he? Probably younger than Brad. Or maybe more successful. He seems to possess qualities Brad doesn't, or at least, that's what he wants you to believe. But Brad, he's always been there for you. He listens when you need to vent, supports you when you're struggling, and sacrifices for you when it really matters." Olivia tensed at his words, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to respond to that." Nick pressed on, unwavering. "In the past 2 weeks, you've missed 2 significant moments. Your son's birthday and your 9th anniversary dinner. Both times, it was because this man needed your attention." Her breath hitched. "Nothing has happened between us," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "We're just friends." Nick's response was calm, almost detached. "The kind of friend you keep secret from your husband? The kind who knows more about your marriage than most people? Hasn't he encouraged you to see Brad as the problem? Every time Brad gets suspicious, you take it as proof he's being unreasonable. But is that really the truth?" Olivia's lips parted in shock, her complexion turning pale. "How do you know all of this?" she whispered. Nick held her gaze firmly. "Because I've been paying attention. Let's be honest, when your son hugged you and told you he loved you, or when Brad planned that anniversary dinner, which one did you prioritize?" A lump formed in Olivia's throat as she absorbed his words. "I only missed our anniversary because he was grieving a friend who had just passed away," she said shakily. "It wasn't planned, it just happened." Nick gave a slow nod. "I understand how you justify it. But look at yourself right now. You're sitting here, waiting for him, even while insisting nothing is happening. If Brad were the one in this situation, would you still think it was innocent? Or would you consider it crossing the line?" Olivia flinched at the question, but remained silent. Nick continued, his voice steady but firm. Your charming friend has probably made you believe Brad isn't the partner you truly desire, just someone filling the gaps you think exist in your marriage. Maybe you feel some responsibility for how this started, but you're still drawn to him, even flattered by the attention. It unsettles you, yet you've convinced yourself that nothing serious has happened. Still, deep down, the guilt lingers, and you hope Brad never pieces it together. Olivia's face crumpled as she wiped at her tears. I won't tell Brad. I can't. He'll figure it out on his own. Nick shook his head. Let's focus on what he thinks is happening. This man sees someone vulnerable, preoccupied, and easy to manipulate. Olivia opened her mouth to protest, but Nick lifted a hand, silencing her. Don't interrupt me. He's not as innocent as he seems. He knows exactly what he's doing. You might believe he genuinely cares about you, but that's only part of the story. This isn't just about you. It's about Brad. He thrives on making Brad feel like he's not enough, proving that he holds more influence over you than your own husband. Do you really think it's just a coincidence that you missed two important moments in Brad's life? Olivia's hands trembled. It wasn't like that. The timing was just bad. His friend had passed away, and he needed me. Nick's voice remained firm. Think about it. The timing wasn't accidental. He orchestrated it. And now Brad's birthday is coming up in 3 weeks. Are you going to let this happen again? Olivia's face turned pale. I can't. Nick raised an eyebrow. Let me remind you, on your anniversary, Brad sat alone at a restaurant, waiting for you. Meanwhile, you were wrapped up in this man's arms. And when you texted Brad some weak excuse about a sick friend, you didn't even bother making it believable, did you? And now, you're skipping work to see him. What does that say about your priorities? Olivia drew in a shaky breath. He doesn't want to hurt Brad, she whispered. He just wants me. Nick let out a dry chuckle. Of course he does. He knows everything you've shared about Brad, his doubts, his insecurities. And he's using it all to drive a wedge between you two. He needs that distance, that tension, to keep you tangled in his game. But the moment he's certain he has you, he won't hesitate to make sure Brad finds out. And when he does, it won't be the truth. It'll be his version of it, twisted to serve his own interests. Olivia's eyes widened in horror. How do you know all this? She whispered. Nick's expression hardened. Because I've seen it before. Louise and I have been happily married for years, but I've watched situations like this unfold. You have two choices: keep lying to yourself and let this spiral out of control, or face reality and stop it before it destroys everything. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. Brad can't find out, she choked out. Nick exhaled, his gaze unwavering. If you keep going down this path, he will find out. And when he does, it'll be far worse than you can imagine. That man will make sure Brad hears about it, and he won't hesitate to twist the story however he needs to. Olivia sobbed quietly, shaking her head. I can't tell him. Nick leaned forward, his tone softer but insistent. Then don't do anything else you'll regret. Don't meet him. Don't even say goodbye. Because if you let this continue, Brad will find out, and when he does, there will be no going back. A deep voice interrupted from behind them. Is this man bothering you? Nick turned to see a tall, thin man with a thick beard standing nearby. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. You must be Reed, he said evenly. Reed hesitated, then shook it, but Nick's grip tightened, pulling him in closer. His voice dropped to a low, deliberate whisper. Listen carefully. If you try to make a scene, you'll regret it. If you so much as mention my wife again, there will be consequences. Reed winced as Nick released his hand. What the hell are you? He started, his voice faltering. Nick leaned in, his tone ice cold. I'm the one who sees right through you. Don't humiliate yourself over this. She isn't worth it. Straightening, Nick turned back to Olivia. His voice was quieter now, almost gentle. You still have a chance, he said. Go home. Be honest with Brad. Tell him before this gets any worse. He deserves that much. Olivia nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Nick's expression softened briefly. Don't thank me, he murmured. Just do the right thing.